April 29, 1945. The Maeda, Escarpment, Okinawa. A vertical wall of coral rock rises 60 meters out of the earth, and at its summit, American soldiers are dying in numbers that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The men have already given this place a nickname that needs no explanation. They call it Hacksaw Ridge. Smoke drifts across broken ground littered with the dead, and somewhere among the boulders a lone figure moves without a weapon in his hands. He is not running for cover. He is running towards the wounded. His name is Desmond Doss, a 26-year-old Army medic from Lynchburg, Virginia, and by the time the sun sets on this stretch of the ridge, he will have spent the entire night alone on the plateau, under fire, lowering wounded man after wounded man down the cliff face on a rope and litter system he improvised on the spot. He carries no rifle. He never has. Doss is a Seventh-day Adventist and a conscientious objector who enlisted anyway, refusing to kill but refusing just as firmly to stay home. His comrades once mocked him for it. Tonight, they are alive because of it. Each time he finds another casualty, witnesses later recall him repeating a version of the same quiet prayer under his breath, asking simply for the strength to save one more. He ties a bowline knot around the wounded man, eases him over the escarpment's edge, and lowers him hand over hand until other soldiers below can take the weight. Then he turns back into the smoke, and again, and again. By the time American forces finally secure the ridge, Doss has personally rescued somewhere in the region of 75 men, a figure so extraordinary that when the citation for his Medal of Honor was later drafted, the Army rounded the number down out of caution rather than risk overstating the case. He will become the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military decoration for valor, and he will receive it not for killing the enemy, but for the opposite. He never fired a single shot in the entire war. This matters because Hacksaw Ridge was not an aberration. It was the culmination of a habit Doss had built over 3 years of combat, from the jungles of Guam to the black volcanic slopes of Leyte, a habit built on one unshakable principle. While there is a wounded man on the field, the medic does not leave. That principle, and the machinery of belief and training behind it, is the subject of what follows, because behind every unarmed man who ran into gunfire to drag another soldier to safety lay a system, an ideology, and a set of hard-won lessons about what battlefield medicine actually required. To understand why a man like Doss could exist at all, and why the United States Army came to depend on medics who refused to carry weapons, you first have to understand the scale of the problem battlefield medicine faced by the middle of the Second World War, and how close the Allied armies came to losing men not to enemy fire but to the simple, brutal arithmetic of blood loss and time. At the outbreak of the war, the standard assumption among most combat armies was straightforward, and it would turn out catastrophically wrong. A wounded man was expected to make his own way to an aid station, or to be carried by whichever comrade happened to be nearby, with no particular training and no particular equipment. Casualty statistics from the First World War had already exposed the flaw in this thinking. Roughly 1 in 6 wounded soldiers who died on that war's battlefields did not die from the wound itself. They died from blood loss and shock in the hour or two after being hit. A window military doctors would come to call the golden hour, during which prompt treatment could mean the difference between survival and death. Yet armies had been slow to build a system around that discovery. Even where the golden hour principle was understood, the practical machinery to act on it barely existed. Plasma had only become widely available to frontline units from around 1942 onward, and even then, supply chains across the Pacific Theater were unreliable, with bottles frequently arriving damaged or spoiled by tropical heat. A medic might reach a wounded man in time only to discover his kit contained sulfa powder and bandages, but no means of replacing the blood volume the man had already lost. The tools existed in principle long before they existed reliably in a medic's pouch on a forward slope under fire. Problem deepened with the nature of the fighting the Allies now faced in the Pacific. Unlike the relatively open terrain of North Africa or the hedgerows of Normandy, islands such as Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa presented near vertical cliffs, dense jungle, and cave networks, honeycombed with Japanese defenders who had been ordered to fight to the last man. Evacuation routes that might take minutes in Europe could take hours across broken coral and volcanic ash. A soldier hit by shrapnel on a ridge like Hacksaw might lie exposed for the better part of a day before any stretcher party could reach him, if one could reach him at all, because Japanese gunners had learned a specific and terrible tactic. They deliberately targeted medics and stretcher bearers, on the calculation that a wounded soldier left screaming on the field would draw 2 or 3 more men out to rescue him, all of whom then became targets in turn. Against this, the existing solution was inadequate. Battalion aid stations were typically positioned hundreds of meters behind the front line, sometimes further, and the men tasked with reaching casualties before they could be moved that far were themselves given only rudimentary first aid training, a single canvas pouch of supplies, and, in the vast majority of cases, a rifle to defend themselves with, which under the Geneva Convention technically stripped them of protected non-combatant status the moment they used it. Casualty clearance in the early Pacific campaigns was slow, chaotic, and often fatal for the wounded man twice over, first from the enemy and then from the hours spent waiting. The United States Army had, on paper, addressed some of this by 1943, introducing dedicated combat medic roles distinct from the ordinary rifleman, with Red Cross brassards and additional training in trauma care, plasma administration, and wound stabilization. But this created its own dilemma, one that sat at the very heart of what made Desmond Doss such an unusual figure. Should a medic carry a weapon? Military logic said yes for self-preservation. Doss and a small number of men like him said no, on the grounds that a man who carried a weapon could no longer credibly claim the protections owed to a non-combatant, and more importantly, on the grounds of a personal religious conviction that he had sworn never to take a human life. The Army did not know quite what to do with men like this. Many officers considered them a liability. Doss was harassed, threatened with court-martial for refusing direct orders to carry a rifle, and at one point nearly discharged as unfit for service before his commanding officers relented and allowed him to serve, unarmed, on his own terms. It is against this backdrop of institutional skepticism and battlefield desperation that Doss's method took shape, not as a piece of official doctrine handed down from a training facility, but as something closer to a personal system, refined under fire, that the Army would only later come to recognize as a genuine tactical innovation in its own right. Doss trained initially at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where his refusal to handle a weapon during basic training made him something of a pariah among his own company, several of whom petitioned to have him removed from their unit altogether. What he built instead, largely through his own initiative, was a personal doctrine of battlefield triage and evacuation that prioritized speed of stabilization over anything else. Where standard practice called for a wounded man to be treated and then carried by stretcher team to the rear, Doss developed an obsessive focus on the immediate application of pressure dressings and plasma in the field, often within meters of the enemy position, on the theory that a man stabilized where he fell had a far better chance than one who bled for the 20 minutes it took to reach him by more conventional means. The rope and litter descent he used at the Maeda Escarpment was itself a piece of improvised engineering rather than issued equipment. Faced with a sheer coral cliff that made conventional stretcher evacuation impossible, Doss adapted a technique using a simple wooden stretcher lashed with rope in a double bowline configuration, allowing one man, alone, to lower a casualty of considerable weight, often close to 80 kilograms in full kit, down a rock face using body weight and friction rather than brute strength, roughly the same principle a modern climber uses when abseiling, though built from whatever rope and timber he could scavenge on the plateau. He is documented as having repeated this process alone, dozens of times across a single night, working without rest, without relief, and largely without light, because any illumination would have drawn Japanese fire onto the entire position. His method extended to something less tangible but arguably just as important: a refusal, absolute and unbending, to leave any wounded man behind regardless of the tactical situation, a principle that ran directly counter to standard infantry doctrine, which held that a position under threat of being overrun should be abandoned by all personnel, wounded included if necessary, to preserve the greater number. Doss simply would not accept this calculation. Multiple accounts from Guam and Leyte describe him remaining in forward positions well after his unit had been ordered to withdraw, treating and moving casualties others had already judged unreachable. None of this was formally trained. It could not have been because no doctrine yet existed that assumed an unarmed man would do it. What Doss represents, in the wider history of military medicine, is less a technology than a proof of concept, that battlefield casualty rates could be meaningfully reduced by individuals willing to treat the golden hour as an absolute priority, even at direct and repeated personal risk, and that doing so did not require a weapon. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational record, patchy as it inevitably is for a single soldier's actions amid the chaos of Pacific Island fighting, nonetheless paints a consistent picture across 3 separate campaigns. On Guam, in 1944, Doss is documented treating and evacuating wounded under sustained fire during the advance on Fonte Hill. On Leyte, later that year, he is recorded repeatedly returning to exposed positions to retrieve casualties his own company had written off as unreachable. It is Okinawa, however, and specifically the fighting for the Maeda Escarpment through late April and early May 1945 that produced the events for which he is remembered. On May 5, 1945, days after the initial escarpment rescues, Doss was wounded himself, struck by a grenade that embedded 17 fragments of shrapnel in his legs. Rather than call another medic to his position and risk exposing a second man, accounts describe him treating his own wounds where he lay for a period of hours before allowing evacuation, and even then insisting stretcher-bearers first treat a more critically wounded soldier nearby. While being carried out on a litter, he is reported to have spotted a more severely injured man and rolled off his own stretcher to give up his place, before then being hit again, this time by a sniper's bullet that shattered his arm, and crawling nearly 300 meters to the aid station, rather than pull another man from the fighting to assist him. The psychological effect on his own company is better documented than any equivalent effect on the Japanese defenders, for whom, understandably, no comparable testimony survives. What we know from American accounts is that men who had mocked Doss in training came, by Okinawa, to regard him with something closer to reverence, several later stating that his presence alone altered their willingness to advance into contested ground, because they knew that if hit, they would not be left. Whether Japanese soldiers on the ridge were even aware they were facing an unarmed man is not recorded and likely never will be, since so few of the defenders on that section of the escarpment survived the battle to be interviewed afterward. Doss's case did not exist in isolation, and it is worth setting it against the wider record of how other armies of the period handled the same fundamental problem. The German Wehrmacht maintained a broadly similar medic structure, the Sanitator, typically armed with a sidearm for self-defense and operating under the assumption, largely borne out in Western Front engagements, that Allied forces would generally respect Red Cross markings. On the Eastern Front, this assumption collapsed almost entirely, and German and Soviet medics alike frequently operated as de facto combatants, a grim illustration of how quickly the Geneva Convention's protections could evaporate once an enemy decided casualties were valid targets, exactly the calculation Japanese defenders had made regarding American stretcher parties in the Pacific. The Soviet Red Army took a markedly different approach, formally decorating and rewarding medics, often women, for the number of wounded personally dragged from the field, with medals awarded on a sliding scale tied directly to casualty counts recovered, a system that produced its own remarkable individual records, but which operated on entirely different incentive structures to the American model, being centrally directed rather than a product of individual religious conviction. What set Doss apart from all of these was not the courage involved, which was hardly unique to him, but the specific combination of refusing a weapon entirely while operating in a theater where medics were being deliberately targeted, a combination so unusual that his own army very nearly prevented it from happening at all. No other major combatant, anti-nation of the war, produced a documented equivalent. A completely unarmed combat medic operating in a war zone where the enemy had explicitly abandoned any pretense of respecting non-combatant status. It is this combination, unarmed conviction, meeting a battlefield that offered no protection for it, that the Medal of Honor citation ultimately recognized as without precedent. The material impact of what Doss achieved is, in the strictest historical sense, modest when measured purely in numbers against the scale of the Okinawa campaign, in which more than 12,000 American servicemen died, and total casualties on both sides likely exceeded 200,000. 75 men saved, even accepting the figure as broadly accurate, represents a fraction of that toll. But the material record was never really the point, and later military historians studying the case have generally agreed that its true significance was doctrinal and psychological rather than statistical. Doss's actions, and the eventual decision to award him the Medal of Honor, despite considerable institutional discomfort with a decorated soldier who had never fired a weapon, forced a rethink within the American military establishment about what combat valor actually required, and helped cement the principle, now considered foundational to modern military medicine, that casualty evacuation under fire was itself a form of combat action deserving equal recognition to offensive engagement. The rope and litter technique he improvised on the escarpment has since been studied by military historians as an early example of field-expedient casualty evacuation, under conditions where conventional stretcher-bearing was physically impossible, principles that would later be formalized in mountain and vertical rescue training used by military and civilian emergency services alike. Doss himself survived the war, though his wounds and a subsequent bout of tuberculosis contracted during his hospitalization left him with lasting disability, and he died in 2006 at the age of 87. His story reached a global audience in 2016 through the film Hacksaw Ridge, which, while dramatized in places, was based directly on his documented Medal of Honor citation and surviving testimony from men who served alongside him. His original uniform and citation are held today at the Desmond Doss Memorial in Rising Fawn, Georgia, and his story remains part of the standard curriculum at several American military medical training institutions. There is also a quieter, more institutional legacy worth noting. The Doss case fed into a broader post-war re-examination of how the American armed forces classified and trained combat medics, contributing to a gradual shift, formalized over the following decades, toward treating battlefield casualty care as a specialized discipline in its own right, rather than an adjunct duty handed to whichever soldier happened to have a red brassard. The emphasis on stabilizing a casualty at the point of injury, rather than rushing an unstable patient to the rear, which Doss practiced out of necessity on the Maeda Escarpment, anticipated by decades what modern combat medicine now calls tactical field care, a principle at the core of every Western military trauma protocol in use today. It is a strange kind of legacy for a man who never fired a shot, that some of the doctrine now governing how soldiers are kept alive on modern battlefields traces a line back to one conscientious objector's stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. Return for a moment to that ridge, to the night of April the 29th, 1945, to a man alone on 60 meters of coral rock with no weapon and no relief, tying rope after rope around man after man, lowering them one at a time into the dark. He had been told he could not serve. He had been told more than once that he should leave. He did neither. What he did instead was simpler and harder than anything doctrine could have prescribed. He stayed, because someone was still up there, and staying was the only answer he had ever been prepared to give. 75 men went home to families who never knew his name until decades later. 75 men who would otherwise be names on a memorial wall instead lived to grow old, to have children of their own, to forget, in the ordinary business of living, that a night on a cliff in Okinawa had ever nearly ended differently. That is the arithmetic that matters here, not the scale of the campaign around it, but the fact that one unarmed man decided the wounded were not expendable, and then spent a war proving it. One rope, one man, one lowered stretcher at a time. He never carried a rifle. He never needed one. He carried something the war could not take from him, and he brought 75 men down off that ridge to prove it.